time today, and we do have some people still joining. I wanted to let you know, you probably saw in the chat that we have everyone muted for this presentation, and we're hoping to take care of questions through our chat function. So please feel free to put your questions in there as they come up. My name is Carrie Harlow, and I work with the Career and Education Outreach Program at VSAC, and I'm joined today by Stacey King. She also works with the Career and Education Outreach Program at VSAC, and Stacey works with the EOC program, Educational Opportunity Centers, working with adult learners, and I work with the Talent Search and Gear Up programs, working with middle and high school students. Today's presentation is Financial Aid 101. This is really a presentation for folks who work with learners of all types and who maybe need a little bit more information about financial aid or need a refresher because they've been away for it for a while. And hopefully we'll be able to get you quite a bit of information. We only have about an hour together today, so we're going to try to ask questions or answer questions when we have availability. If we have a lot of questions and we're not able to answer them all, we will take what we get in the chat and follow up with information. This presentation is also being recorded today, so there will be a recording posted on our Financial Aid Resources for Education Professionals page shortly after this event happens. It will also be on our My VSAC Story YouTube page. So let's get started. First, I want to just acknowledge that we have a number of applications that learners will need to fill out if they would like to pursue post-secondary education, particularly if they're looking at colleges or trade schools that are eligible for federal financial aid. The first application is the FAFSA, the free application for federal student aid. Learners may be filling out Vermont grant applications. There may be institutional applications that students have to fill out, and they should be checking on post-secondary institution websites, as well as maybe financial aid publications that those institutions put out. But one of the applications that you may have heard of is the CSS Financial Aid Profile, which is available on the College Board website. And that form is required for certain schools, but not for all. So it's important to check what you have to fill out. Students may also be filling out the VSAC Unified Scholarship application, as well as other scholarship applications. And then many students, especially their first year, may be filling out loan applications, and some returning students may be filling out additional loan applications for non-federal loans, possibly each year that they're in school. So our session goals are to cover a number of these applications and talk about them, but also to talk about programs that are available to students and also to give you some information resources. And let's get started with the FAFSA. The FAFSA is really the starting point for federal student aid. It's required for any of the federal student aid programs, including direct loans, as well as for the Vermont Incentive Grant and Part-Time Grant programs. It may also be required for institutional aid and need-based aid at some post-secondary institutions, as well as for scholarships. There are some scholarship programs that do have a financial need component, and the FAFSA shows that financial need. So how do people apply? Well, most students, I believe last year we heard that more than 99% of the students who apply electronically. And they use the FAFSA website or the My Student Aid app. The FAFSA website can be viewed on desktops as well as some mobile devices. They have recently redone the FAFSA so that it can be used and viewed on a number of different devices. People could also use a paper FAFSA, but they will need to download and print that from studentaid.gov. And for the upcoming school year, the 21-22 school year, so 2021-2022, the FAFSA is open October 1st. October 1st is not a deadline for that school year. It's just the first date that it's available. An important part of the FAFSA is having an FSA ID. And the FSA ID is a username and password that a student will create, and possibly if they're a dependent student, one parent will create to access FAFSA on the web. Using FAFSA information on the My Student Aid app, they will need that FSA ID for that. federal student loan entrance counseling and the master promissory note, annual student loan acknowledgement, which we'll talk about at our next session. We'll talk about that more on September 24th, as well as teach grant agreement to serve documents. For the FSA ID, students, parents, borrowers will create a unique username and password that has to be connected to a working email address or cell phone number, or both. And the person also has to have answers for 4 challenge questions. And those 4 challenge questions are really just to help the person who has the FSA ID, if, for instance, the email address or phone number or both that they use get changed and they can't get confirmation or reminders from that. The 4 challenge questions will help them get into their account and be able to make updates. So for the FSA ID, we have some general tips. We recommend that the person who's creating the FSA ID have their email account open before they start it, and then that way they can get that email and respond to validate that account. We recommend that students, parents create an FSA ID before they start their FAFSA. There are opportunities to create that FSA ID during the FAFSA, but what we find is that it does take longer, and there are some confirmations that have to happen. So it's great if you have an FSA ID that's been confirmed before you go into the FAFSA. And we also recommend that people have suggestions for additions to usernames. Maybe the username you pick doesn't work, but you can add a middle name or initial. You could add a year. You could include a house number or the last digits of the phone number of the FSA ID applicant. What you want to stay away from is identifying information like date of birth or social security number. Don't have that in the username. There's also, for you folks who enjoy YouTube videos and will use YouTube videos to help you work through something, there is a YouTube video available as well. And let me just mention that this presentation will also be posted on the Education Professionals Financial Aid Resources page. So these links that we have will be live in that document. So you could go into this presentation later if you wanted to access that. So whose information is on the FAFSA is a question that we get asked in VSAC outreach quite often. Correct, Stacey? She's there, she's nodding. And so it's a question that we get asked very often. And if we were meeting in person today, I would have a handout for you that has this information on it, but we'll go through it quickly. So these are the questions that are asked on the FAFSA to determine if a student is dependent or independent. Were you born before January 1st, 1998? This is for the student to answer. As of today, are you married? At the beginning of the school you're applying for, will you be working on a master's or doctoral program? Are you currently active duty in the U.S. Armed Forces? Are you a veteran? Do you have or will you have children who receive more than half their support from you between July 1st of 2020 and June 30th of 2021? Do you have dependents other than your children or spouse who live with you and who receive more than half their support from you now and through June 30th, 2022? At any time since you turned 13, were both your parents deceased? Were you in foster care? Were you a dependent or ward of the court? As determined by a court in your state of legal residence, are you or were you an emancipated minor? Does someone other than your parent or step-parent have legal guardianship of you as determined by a court in your state of legal residence? And then the last questions are questions really about unaccompanied homeless youth. And does your high school or school homeless liaison determine this? Did a director of an emergency or transitional emergency shelter, or transitional housing program determine you were unaccompanied and homeless? Or did the director of a runaway or homeless youth center or transitional living program determine that you were also unaccompanied and were homeless or at risk of being homeless? So those questions, if it's no to all those questions, the student is considered dependent for federal student aid and they have to use parental information. However, a dependency override can still come from the college. That could be considered and the student would need to appeal and send documentation when available. And I should mention to you that just because a parent says, that they're unwilling to pay or unwilling to give their information, that is not necessarily a reason for a student to be considered independent. So whose information is on the FAFSA? For dependent students, this is another by the way, this is another handout that if we were meeting in person, we would have for you. It is also available on our financial aid resources page. But which parent information is required? If the parents live together, the biological or legal parents live together, regardless of marital status, both parents' information is used on the FAFSA. If the parents don't live together, it's the parent the student lived with the most in the past year. If that was 50-50, and if you call federal student aid, they will often say, in most years, there are 365 days, so somebody may have gotten an extra day. But if it's 50-50, if the family split that day, who provided more financial support? And then when you figure out who that parent is, if that parent is married, then the parent and step parent will be reported on the FAFSA. For independent students, if the student is married, it is both the student and the spouse. But if the student's single, separated, or divorced and not remarried, it will be the student only whose information's on the FAFSA. From the FAFSA, information is reported, and then the Federal Student Aid Program determines the student's financial need. And they do that by determining this thing called an EFC, expected family contribution. The family contribution is the starting point. It's not what families have to pay. And it looks at the student and the parents for the dependent student. It looks at the student and the parents' income, assets, family size, number of family members in college, and the age of the older parent, or if it's an independent student, it'll be the age of the student. Which income are we looking at is a common question when we're talking about the FAFSA. The folks with federal student aid use the term prior year income. So if you would be attending college in the school year that starts July 1st, 2020, they're using tax information from 2018. For students who will be high school seniors or who are high school seniors this year, and they're applying for financial aid to begin school in 2021, we're using tax information from 2019. And we see a number of frequent errors on the FAFSA. Some of those include parent and student social security numbers, possibly divorced, remarried, or unmarried, but living together, parent information. Income earned by parents or step-parents is sometimes misreported. Untaxed income, US income taxes paid, household size. Sometimes people forget to include the college student or other college students in the household size. Number of household members in college. Real estate and investment net worth, including assets. Sometimes people will include assets that aren't supposed to be included on the FAFSA, like the family home. That does not get reported on the FAFSA. Sometimes families report only the value rather than the net worth of the asset, which means instead of reporting the value minus the debt of that asset, they only report the value. We see a common error of people not signing the FAFSA or people not submitting the FAFSA after signing it. I will say that the not submitting the FAFSA after signing, I tested that out, and you will get emails from Federal Student Aid that says, hey, just wanted to remind you that you haven't submitted your FAFSA yet. So that is something that they do watch for. When a student files a FAFSA, they receive a FAFSA confirmation. And so they receive access to a student aid report. And when a student logs into their FAFSA, they can see that the current status of the application. And so in this case, the student, their application status is it has processed successfully. But if they were missing a signature, it would used if there was no email address and a paper application was used. Students can log in to FAFSA.gov at any time to check their status. I want to talk a little bit about FAFSA verification. And that's a process by which the U.S. Department of Education confirms through the college financial aid offices that information provided by students and families on the FAFSA is accurate. And so a student can be selected for verification by the Department of Education or by a college, and the items to be verified will vary. Although most often, the verification that happens is verification of income, family size, and number in college. And financial aid will not be dispersed until verification is complete. And so the student needs to do that with each of the colleges that they've applied to for financial aid. Let's talk about the availability of federal student aid. I just want to talk about the maximums, for instance, for the current school year that we're in. We do not have that information necessarily for the school year coming up. So for the 2020-2021 school year, the maximum federal Pell Grant for a family or student with an EFC of 0 is $6,345. Federal work study will depend on the funds available at the school, so that could be different from college to college. And for direct subsidized and unsubsidized loan for a first-year student, it's $5,500 total for a dependent or $9,500 total for an independent student. The maximums for both of those loans are $3,500 of that will be subsidized, and we'll be talking a little bit more about subsidized versus unsubsidized in a couple of minutes. There are also direct plus loans for parents, and for those direct plus loans, the only limit on those is the cost of attendance at the college minus the other aid received. There's a great worksheet called Federal Student Aid at a Glance that people can look at, which will have information. The current one that's up on the Federal Student Aid website is for the school year that we're in right now. That was published in 2019, but it should be updated probably in the next month or so. And so we're ready to take some questions.
All right, so we've had some excellent questions in the chat so far. We have one about foster youth and the idea that some foster youth are able to attend college for free, but that's not necessarily the case. And the reality is that being a foster youth means that you don't have to provide parent and guardian information. It does not mean that you go to college for free. It depends on that student's income. We have some foster youth who work a lot, and that impacts their financial aid. It also depends on the cost of the school they're attending and what the school offers for aid. So it's definitely an apply and see what the aid packages look like. There are more resources and many resources available for foster youth. That it also depends whether those students applied for those forms. What happens with a stalemate when a parent refuses to share financial information for a child? If the college is unable to perform a dependency override for reasons such as an abusive situation where obtaining parent documentation is not safe, if they cannot prove that, the parent information is required for federal financial aid. And so what results is that the student is only able to borrow student loans at that point. They are not eligible for grant-based aid from the federal or state level. It is unfortunate, and it's definitely where a student would be working very closely with their college financial aid office to see what they can do. Please expand on the verification process. That is if something is flagged on a FAFSA, either by the Department of Ed or a college, where they want further information, the student would then need to provide, typically it's a worksheet page that lists information that they need, such as who's in the household, as opposed to the question on the FAFSA of how many were in the household. It gives a little more detail. And they can be asked for a bunch of different reasons, but the most common is income verification. A correction question, if a student makes an error on their FAFSA and they need to correct it, do both the parent and student need to sign the correction? It depends on what they were asked for. If it's just a change in schools, then the student can sign it, the parent is not needed. If it's parent information that was changed, then the parent would need to also sign it. If a student's parent does not qualify for a PLUS loan, will the student be eligible to access this resource? No, it is not a student loan. But if a student is not eligible, if a parent is not eligible for a PLUS loan, students may be eligible for an additional $4,000 in direct student loans, and they would work again with their college financial aid office to make that happen. If a student is awarded work study but does not utilize it due to scheduling or job availability, will they lose it the following year? No, it is an income-based offer, so every year on the FAFSA, it will determine whether they are eligible to be offered work study. They might not be able to get the same job that they said they were going to do. That boss might not hire them back. How many hours is it recommended for a student to work per year? At what point will it negatively impact their aid? Carrie, do you know where the calculation is right now for the level that a student can work before it is part of the EFC calculation?
So I think for last year's EFC, it was, oh goodness, I'm not going to remember the exact figure, but they usually protect close to the first $7,000 that a dependent student earns before it impacts their financial aid. Please also know that federal work study programs, financial aid is not used in determining your financial aid for the next year. So we want to make certain that there's a place on the FAFSA where a student should enter in the work study they earned during that year, so that it's not looked at as a resource for the upcoming year, because we don't want to count financial aid in determining financial aid.
Okay, thank you.
And then there was another question about proof needed for a dependency override. What I would say is that sometimes that requires a letter from someone who's familiar with the situation. There may need to be other documentation, even for students who are considered independent. So a student who's in a legal guardianship might have to submit copies of that paperwork. A student who's independent because they were in foster care may have to submit paperwork from DCF that confirms that. So there will be documentation required. And for each college, they may have their own documentation that needs to be submitted. They might have a form that needs to be filled out, or they might have something specific that they're asking for.
And then our last question on this section, there was a verification of citizenship. That does happen. And then you have to provide documentation to the college to prove your citizenship. And then the FAFSA question about a business, you do not report the business if it is employing 100 people or less than 100 people that way. Whether it's an LLC, a sole proprietorship, or any other form, it doesn't matter. What matters is the number of employees, whether it has to be reported. All right, I think that was all of them. If not, we will check the chat and get back to people. All right, so we're gonna go into the state funds and the Vermont grants, and we can just go right to the next slide. It all begins with My VSAC. So on the VSAC website, there's a button that a student will click to get to the My VSAC portal. And this is a place where a student will create an account, and they will use this account not only to apply for state aid, but also to do VSAC-assisted scholarships. And they'll come in and do this each year. The contact information that's provided, that email and address, really needs to be up to date. And when a student is creating this, which it's a student account, remember that, especially if a parent is creating it, you're creating it as the student. That email, you want to be sure if it's a school-based email that the student will still continue to have access to that email after graduation. If that is not the case, then the student should be using a personal email that will continue to be accessible. And the other thing to keep in mind in terms of your email and your postal address and your phone being updated is that the colleges, the FAFSA, FSAID, and VSAC are all different entities. Changing it in one does not change it in all, so you need to be sure you're reaching out to all the parties to let them know your current information. So to create this, it's 2 steps. The student goes into the My VSAC portal and enters their email address and identifying information. And then a link is emailed to that address to confirm it's active, and that's where the password is created, and then the account is active. If a student loses or forgets their My VSAC login, or someone else created it for them, they need to use those prompts of I forgot my username or I forgot my password. And if those are not successful, they should call VSAC grants. Do not create another account because that will create confusion on the back end. We love talking to people, and VSAC grants is very helpful in resetting accounts if needed. So feel free to call. There are 4 kinds of Vermont grants. Typically when people are discussing Vermont grants in terms of attending college, they're referring to either a full-time or a part-time Vermont degree grant. And those would follow along with the courses and the work that you're doing if you're using the FAFSA to fill out for federal financial aid. There's also a Vermont advancement grant, used to be called the non-degree grant. And this is for taking 1 or 2 classes at a college or to do non-college, non-Title IV eligible work, like getting a commercial driver's license or an LNA or working through a tech center to do an adult program. So those are Vermont grant eligible programs. And then there are micro grants. These are small pools of money that students can be nominated for either by their in-state college financial aid office or through an outreach counselor in VSAC. They range between $50 and $400 and are for emergency expenses that would prevent a student from completing their term. So in the past, when people were driving, that could be the need for snow tires that would prevent people from getting to their classes. Nowadays, it's often needing help with technology or paying an electric bill in order to remain in their online classes, for example. All right. The application to get to the grants is at the MyVSAC site. So you're going to file your application and submit documentation all in this account. So you can see this is an image of the VSAC.org page, and up in the top right, there's a button that says MyVSAC. There are multiple ways to get to it, but that's the easiest. The degree grant application will be available on October 1st at the same time as the FAFSA becomes available. And then the advancement grant runs on a different schedule. And if a student is looking to attend a program that starts before the end of June this year, that advancement grant is available now, that application. If they're looking to start a program that begins in July or later, they would that application would become available in May. And they're all right here at this MyVSAC account. If you're linking from the FAFSA, it's really kind of a cool tool that they added a few years ago. At the end of the FAFSA on the confirmation page, you will see right above your estimated expected family contribution, a link where you can start your state grant application. It's important to encourage people to allow pop-ups when they are completing their FAFSA in order to do this link from the FAFSA to the Vermont grant. If you do link and transfer your information, the first 3 schools that you listed on the FAFSA automatically will go in as potential schools to your Vermont grant. You can add more in your MyVSAC. You can add more schools, and you can go in and choose which one it is that you are going to actually attend once you have made that decision. The information that's asked for the degree grants is the same as what is on the FAFSA in terms of the prior year. So you would use 2019 income information if you're looking at 2021-2022 school year. But it also asks for some asset information that is not on the FAFSA. The state grant will ask for information, and they want it at the time of the application. So they're not asking you to go back and think of what it was in 2019. But currently, what is your home value and debt? Currently, what is your family farm value and debt? And currently, what is your small business value and debt? And that information is added in along with what came from the FAFSA to determine Vermont degree grant eligibility for either full-time or part-time. If more information is needed, whether it's a worksheet about a non-custodial parent or anything along those lines, information is going to be requested by email at that account that was put in the student account. That's the first place that information will be asked for or reminded. It's also in your MyVSAC account. So if you log into your MyVSAC account, you will see it in a to-do list. If nobody responds and a student does not log back in within 20 days, a paper letter would be mailed to request that information that's missing. And many of the things that are asked for can be completed online right within that MyVSAC portal, including uploading tax returns and W-2s if they're requested. In terms of letting people know if things are different, it's important to remember that what the colleges see and what VSAC sees from the FAFSA information is a snapshot from 2019. So if things have changed, it's really important to let colleges and VSAC know so that they can reflect that. Colleges want the most up-to-date information so they can give you the best package that reflects your circumstances. So if somebody has lost hours or lost a job, it's important to let them know. If there are medical or dental bills or very high insurance costs and deductibles that are impacting your ability to pay, that's important to share that information. If a parent or the student changes their marital status, or if there are unusual dependent care expenses, this may be a year where that might be a particular case. If a student is not able to obtain parent information, but it wasn't for one of those reasons that was checked on the FAFSA, for example, if a parent is incarcerated or it is an abusive situation where the parent should not be contacted, or that it is unknown where the parents are, those are circumstances that need to be explained to the college and work with the college, and also to let VSAC know. And then natural disasters, this was really important, particularly back when we had Hurricane Irene. If there are expenses that were not reimbursed or covered by insurance, by FEMA or personal insurance, then letting the schools know that. So basically, just understand that if you didn't answer the question on the FAFSA, or you answered a question but it's not relevant anymore, it's really important to share that information with both the colleges, financial aid offices, and VSAC for special circumstances. All right, so we're also going to talk a little bit about short-term training and certificate funding, and we can go right to the next slide. What I realized is that a couple of these things on this slide really are relevant regardless of whether it's short-term training or degree training. So I'm actually going to go to the right side of the slide and talk about employer contributions, which could be used for any type of post-secondary education potentially. And those could look like tuition reimbursement, for example, from your employer, or it could be student loan repayment agreements or other items. And you find out about that by talking to your HR department or your boss to see if they do anything to support education beyond high school. The Veterans Administration is a great resource for veterans who are looking to continue training or education. They have many different programs, and if you are interested in more detail on that, on October 6th, I will be doing a Zoom room specifically about military connected students and veteran resources. So look at that for that on our VSAC events calendar. Vocational rehabilitation is an amazing program, and these are this is a group for people who have any identified physical, mental, or emotional disability, and you will get support resources in creating an education pathway or a training program in order to get you into a status of employability. So you can get some amazing help in locating resources, but also some literal financial help to pay for classes and training. The Department of Labor also has multiple workforce development programs, including WIOA, which is the Workforce Innovation and Opportunity Act. Those programs provide funding for training and education beyond high school, and it can be for degree programs, such as if you were completing the FAFSA and the Vermont grant application, and can be for non-degree. Some of the things on the left side are specific to those that are looking at short-term training or certificate programs. So they're not necessarily getting a 2 or 4 year degree. Those are definitely great programs to look at the advancement grant for, and we'll talk about that one in a little more detail. There are also registered apprenticeships. There are hundreds of registered apprenticeships happening throughout Vermont in multiple fields. Most commonly people think of electrical and plumbing, but there are other apprenticeship programs as well. And the programs and the providers themselves, so for example, an adult technical center or a provider of commercial driver's license training, etc., may have their own funds that they can also support students with. So it's important to reach out to those providers, whoever's doing the training, to see if they have scholarships or grants that you can apply for. And then there are many scholarships that can be, again, those could be degree or a non-degree. In the short-term and certificate world, we have a scholarship that the adult counselors at EOC have been able to nominate students for, called the Curtis Credential of Value Training Scholarship, which we're really excited about. The Curtis Fund is an amazing supporter of students in Vermont. And these are scholarships that we can use to help with training expenses up to $1,500 for students that are doing training programs that will provide significant employability increase. So reach out to VSAC EOC if you are interested in that. The advancement grant in particular is available now, which I spoke about before. If your program starts before June 30th, you can apply now for an advancement grant. The new ones will be available in May for programs that start July 1 or later. And these are meant for non-degree coursework or doing short-term training programs that are either going to get students ready to take further coursework and move into a degree program or increase their employability. And for this year, there's a limit of $3,000 for the eligibility in fiscal year 2021. If you're using it for college coursework, taking those 1 or 2 classes to test things out, you can do up to 2 classes and up to $1,705 per term. You cannot use more than 2 terms of any kind of state grant per academic year, whether it is an advancement grant or a Vermont degree grant or part-time grant. You can only have 2 terms in a year. You can have up to 6 advancement grants over the lifetime, and it's going to ask for the same income information as the FAFSA and the Vermont degree grant did in terms of prior. So if it's the current year before June 30th, they're going to want 2018 information. If it will be for next year starting in July or later, they'll look at 2019 information. And you can upload the tax returns and W-2s to in your MyVSAC account or mail them in. That will be required in order to get an advancement grant, unlike the FAFSA. So with the FAFSA, you're pulling information in from the IRS potentially or indicating your information. You don't necessarily send your tax return to VSAC, but if it's an advancement grant, you do send your tax return and W-2s to VSAC. This is what the screen looks like when a student has logged into their MyVSAC account. This is the general landing page that they would see. And you can see there's loans, grants, and scholarship opportunities there. So if they're looking to request a Vermont grant or a Vermont advancement grant, they would click on Work with Grants. And then this is actually quite a few choices and not what the student will see now. If they were to log in now, they would have 2 choices, either the 2021 Vermont grant, which is for the degree work, or the 2020-2021 advancement grant for the non-degree work. In May, there will be 3 choices. So people would still be able to do the degree grant for 2021. The advancement grant will stay up until the end of June, but then the 2021-2022 advancement grant will show up in May. Just be sure you're picking the year you want the money and the program that you want. All right, questions for grants in short-term training? So I see that Kate thought the advancement grant was the emergency expenses. No, that's the micro grant. I didn't mention, but I should, that a student must have been awarded either a degree grant or an advancement grant before they can be considered for a micro grant. Yes, so micro grant, small, up to $400. Advancement grant ranges and can be up to $3,000 towards a program in a year. That's it. That's all I have for questions.
All right, wonderful. We're going to move on to VSAC-assisted scholarships and talk about scholarships that students might be eligible for. Our scholarship book will be available soon for students and who will be attending college in 2021, 2022. We will also have the scholarship book available on our website under scholarships at vsac.org. And that scholarship book will have listings of all of the scholarships that we assist with. So we collect the applications, or scholarships that have just asked us to publicize their scholarships. Those will all be in that scholarships booklet. And students apply for those scholarships by, again, being in My VSAC. When they get to that landing page, they will see that in addition to where they can work with grants, there's also a place to work with VSAC-assisted scholarships, and students will be able to apply. What I can tell you is that the VSAC-assisted scholarships will have a deadline of February 11th, 2021 for the 2021-2022 school year. And that application will be available on October 1st, 2020, the same as the Vermont grant application and the FAFSA. So when we talk to people about these VSAC-assisted scholarships, of course, the difference between grants and scholarships is that scholarships have a competition component. Both grants and scholarships are gift aid, which means they're free money, and you generally do not have to pay them back. But with scholarships, there is a competition component. Usually everyone who applies for a scholarship meets the criteria, and then they have to compete to be the one who's named for the scholarship. And it could be based on things like a student's financial need, but it could also be based on a student's grades, or it could be based on a student's artistic talent, which might require a portfolio to be submitted, or it might require community service. So it's important to look through our assisted scholarships book, figure out which scholarships the student can apply for. And the important thing to remember is not only to meet the deadlines, but to beat them. So our deadline is February 11th. However, if a student has information sent in on February 11th, and then they check in with VSAC to make sure everything was received, maybe on February 12th, if there's anything missing, they don't have any time to go back and get that information in. Because with scholarships, the deadline is one of the firm criteria. So you want to make sure that you get things in and can check that they've been received before the deadline. You can check to see if everything has been received on My VSAC, and we'll show you a screen about that during the September 24th training. But when we have students uploading information, or when we have schools uploading information for students in the scholarship program, it gets uploaded to a cloud, and then VSAC downloads everything that night. So you need to allow a day for documents to show up as uploaded. It is the student's responsibility to keep track of the scholarships they applied for and the documents that are required from My VSAC. We help with that, and we'll show you screens about that again on September 24th, so that you can see what it might look like for a student to be able to check on that. And we want to encourage students to allow time for transcripts and recommendations to be done well and sent, not the last minute. So for instance, if a student files their VSAC Unified Scholarship application at 11:59 p.m. on February 11th, then that gives their high school no time to upload a transcript or a recommender from the high school anytime to upload a recommendation letter, because then they have not, they've missed the deadline if the student waits till the last minute to put that scholarship application in. Best practices, it's important that information is labeled. So we want to communicate that with faculty and staff or other people by labeling. What we need on that documentation is usually the student's name and their date of birth, so that we can match it up with the right folder. There was one year where there was one student name. We had 3 students who were all graduating seniors with the same name. So the date of birth is important, as well as labeling what it is. So if it's a recommendation number 1, general, or it's a recommendation number 2 about community service, it should say that on the letter, not in the body of the letter, because we're dealing with a lot of mail and we need to be able to get to that information quickly. It's important for students who are applying for VSAC-assisted scholarships to meet the minimum word length, to answer the questions asked for the essays, and the recommendations that are submitted must be either on letterhead or signed. And then we talk about draft review. There are some common errors when scholarships are competitive. Spelling errors do end up having an impact. You would hope that they wouldn't, but when you have 2 students who are absolutely identical in all things, but one took a little more time on their essay, you can see why that might make a difference. And then we're going to talk about education loans.
And our only question was date for when the scholarship booklets will be available online. I do not have a date for that, but we can guarantee it will be before October 1st, or on October 1st, when the application also becomes available. All right.
Yep, in the past it has come online the last week of September.
That is the hope. All right, so education loans, this is a section that sometimes makes people nervous. All right, let's go right into the next slide. The direct loans to students require that the student completes the FAFSA. So when people talk about federal student loans, they're talking about a direct loan. The college gets that information about income and assets and determines whether the students are eligible for a particular type of student loan. But it's important to note that any income level can be eligible for student loans. There are two types, subsidized and unsubsidized. Only undergraduates who are working on college work that is prior to their first bachelor's degree, so they have not already completed a bachelor's degree, they can be eligible for subsidized, and it also depends upon income. Subsidized loans do not accumulate interest while the student is in school because the federal government is paying that for them until their grace period ends. For unsubsidized loans, they begin accumulating interest as soon as the first allotment is dispersed. There's maximums based on year in college, and we'll talk about those in the next slide. In order to actually get the loan in place, it's not enough just to do the FAFSA. The student will also need to complete entrance counseling, which teaches them about what it means to borrow a student loan, which they complete on studentaid.gov. They log in using their FAFSA credentials, that FSA ID. And there's also a master promissory note, which is the legal document saying that they are borrowing money and they promise to pay it back. That is also completed at studentaid.gov, or you can get a paper master promissory note from requesting it from the college. It's unusual, but it happens. So these are the limits to what students can borrow in their own names. For dependent students, the first year is $5,500. The next year can borrow up to $6,500, and then $7,575. The independent students who either were able to answer yes to one of those dependency questions on the FAFSA, or who have aged out and are over the age of 24, their loan limits are higher. They can borrow $9,500 the first year, another $10,500 the second year, and then $12,500 for the following 2 years. There are also maximums, which I forgot to write down, because the reality is that some students not complete in 4 years, so there is 5th year eligibility, but we did not, I forgot to put them in limits. I apologize.
That's okay, Stacey. Would you like me to jump in for that?
Sure.
So for undergraduate students, dependent undergrads, the maximum is $31,000 that they can borrow. And for independent undergraduates, the maximum is $57,500.
And so it's important to note that that means if you were borrowing the full amount each year, a 5th year would not have that same amount available. You would have less available for that 5th year. Okay. These are the interest rates and origination fees for the current school year. We won't know what 21-22 looks like until about June, when the new rates are set. These are the lowest interest rates we have seen in decades. The undergrad, direct, subsidized, and unsubsidized loans are at 2.75% interest rate, and there's a 1.057% origination fee. Graduate students are a little bit higher, 4.3%, and the PLUS loan is at 5.3%. And note that the PLUS loan has a higher origination fee. And why that matters is because the origination fee is actually deducted from the amount that the student borrows before it is applied to their account. So if they've borrowed $5,500, the origination fee of 1% is $55 and change. That comes off, and then the remainder is applied to their account. So sometimes it's really important for students just to be paying attention that they thought they were fully covered, but then they're $50 or $100 short. It's typically an origination fee issue. The PLUS loans, that stands for Parent Loan for Undergraduate Student. That's originally where the name came from. It's available for parents of the dependent undergraduate students. It's also Grad Plus is available for graduate and professional students that are helping to pay for their post-secondary, post-bachelor's work. The PLUS loan maximum is a cost of attendance at that college minus the other aid that has been offered. So there is no limit there's no dollar limit for any PLUS loan other than what the school costs minus what they offered. It does require a credit check, and there is an endorser alternative for those with credit histories that do not meet the requirements. It's very forgiving. So it has to be a pretty significant issue on the credit in order for the PLUS loan to be the eligibility to be impacted. There are also non-federal education loans, and these are eligible for students that need to borrow beyond their own direct student loans. And we have a great resource called My Education Loans that a student can review and a parent can review, talking about how to choose that private loan or non-federal education loan. And using a loan calculator to compare the total cost is really important. VSAC does have two non-federal education loans. They have a student loan and they have a parent loan, and these are both referred to as an advantage loan. It's important also to keep in mind as people are choosing loans that parent loans are in parents' names. Sorry, Carrie.
Would you like me to take over?
Yes, please.
Sure. So the other thing to keep in mind about these non-federal loans, in addition to if the parents are borrowing, they are the borrowers. The other thing to keep in mind about that is that for the non-federal loans, for the most part, if a student is borrowing, they need to have a co-signer for these non-federal loans. And so that is a person who agrees that they will be paying on the loan if the student cannot. They will be responsible. And when choosing and comparing non-federal loans, it's important to consider things like interest rates, what fees may be held, what are the repayment options available, as well as other benefits like if you choose electronic payment and an auto deduct from your checking account, some lenders will also say that they'll take a certain percentage, maybe 1/4% off of your interest rate. So it's important to think about those things. There are a number of lenders of non-federal loans, and I've seen these mailings because I have a college student myself that will send out something that says, get an interest rate as low as 2%. But the reality is it's really hard to get that teaser interest rate, and you may apply for the loan and then you find out, oh, I'm being charged a higher rate. People can shop around for these loans, and if that happens, they can also say, wait, I don't want this loan. And they can apply for another one. There's an understanding, kind of like when you're shopping for a car loan or a home loan, that there may be multiple applications, and that's not going to affect your credit score as if you're applying for multiple, for instance, credit cards or something like that.
Thank you for taking over for me there.
That's all right.
I had a question that we have some border schools where there are students that may be New Hampshire and New York residents attending Vermont schools, and that they would not be eligible for the VSAC offerings. That's it depends upon the offering. So students can be eligible to borrow a VSAC Advantage loan if they're attending a school in Vermont, even if they're not Vermont residents, or they can be Vermont residents attending school anywhere. There are scholarships that are maybe eligible for students that are New Hampshire or New York residents. For example, in our area, the Gilman Scholarship is in the VSAC booklet, but New Hampshire residents can also apply for it. They do it just at a different spot. Some of the things students are eligible for. And New Hampshire and New York students should definitely be doing the FAFSA as well as their own state grant applications if there are any. And then the other question was origination fees. It's each loan each year, and that is correct. So that fee will be charged each year that the loan is taken out each year.
And just to give a preview, we'll have some more information about how students and borrowers in general will be aware about their borrowing. There's some new tools available, and we'll be talking about that at the September 24th meeting as well. So let's talk a little bit about information resources. We have a bunch of information resources for you. One of those is the Financial Aid Toolkit. That is a federal website, and you can get federal financial aid information. You can get updates. There's tons of college planning and financial aid resources on there. You can do a search and you can say, I want handouts for parents about the FAFSA, and you can pull that information up. Or I want webinars about undocumented youth, and you can find information. So there are lots of links to tools and resources, as well as outreach and social media ideas. I recently went to a social media workshop by Federal Student Aid, and they have said whatever they produce, they are happy to let other people use. So, you know, cute little memes about filing your FAFSA in October, or cute little infographics that talk about student loan forgiveness programs. All of those things are available, and you can find many of them on the Financial Aid Toolkit. In addition, our EdPro News is a great website to have as a resource. We do have financial aid updates on there, content for people's emails and newsletters to families, event information, outreach and research news, as well as career and college planning updates. We have a lot of things changing this year with our not being able to be in person as much as we used to. And we're in the process of setting up now a number of virtual workshops for people with filling out their financial aid applications. And we're going to talk about that more on September 24th. And a lot of those things are getting set up now. So we're hoping to have more information for you soon, including things like VSAC shows you how to file a FAFSA and Vermont grant application, and financial aid forms help that we'll be offering through VSAC. In addition, we have a financial aid resources page for education and agency professionals. And with folks who are new to advising students, I recommend that this get bookmarked with your on your favorite browser. And there's going to be workshop PowerPoints and videos on there, resources for families, FAFSA resources and links, those infographics that I told you about for who's an independent versus dependent student and which parent to use on the FAFSA are on there. There's information about net price calculators as well. So just a wealth of stuff. I recommend having that bookmarked. And then I just wanted to make a plug for September 24th. That will be our federal, state, and VSAC updates. And if you have not registered already, you can register on our events page. And if you're already registered, thank you. We look forward to seeing you. And are there any additional questions? Oh, okay, Michelle, your question got answered. I'm glad. We are really trying to move to virtual so that we can still provide services to students, to learners, to families as part of this process. And we're going to do it a number of different ways, and hopefully in ways that are both live and also recorded so that people can access it later. So I want to thank you all for attending today. Oops, is there another question? Oh, the financial aid resources link. So if I could tell you, it is vsac.org/find-aid resources. And also we are going to be publishing this PowerPoint as a PDF document, and people can access that, and that will be live, and you could actually literally click on the Find Aid resources heading here and get brought to that page. All right, so I want to thank you all again for attending. I know we covered a ton of information, and we look forward to seeing folks on the 24th for updates, and we look forward to working with you and all of the learners you work with in the coming year.
And remember, we're here to help.